Picture this. You've driven 40 minutes. You brought food, something you made from scratch, the way you always have. You're wearing something nice because it matters to you to show up that way, to show them that coming to see them is something you prepared for, something you looked forward to. You knock. They open the door. And they say all the right things. "Hey, come on in. Good to see you." And you step inside. And the next 2 hours are fine. Perfectly fine. No arguments. No harsh words. No obvious slight. And then you drive home. And somewhere on that 40-minute drive back, something happens. A feeling settles in your chest that you can't quite name. Not anger. Not sadness exactly. Just a quiet, deflating sense that you were there, physically present in that house, in that kitchen, at that table. But somehow, you were never quite arrived. You interrupted their real life. And you both knew it. And neither of you said a word about it. If that sounds familiar, if you've made that drive and felt that feeling, I want you to stay with me today. Because what you experienced has a name. And more importantly, it has a limit. A limit that you are allowed, that you are entitled, to set. For over 30 years, I've worked as both a psychologist and a neurologist, and I've sat with thousands of patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who came to me carrying a very specific kind of pain. Not the pain of a crisis. Not the pain of something dramatic or undeniable. But the pain of something that happens slowly, quietly, and on a schedule, usually every few weeks, when they get in their car and drive to their child's house. We talk a great deal, in this culture, about toxic relationships, about cutting people off, about going no contact, and that conversation has its place. But today, I want to talk about something more nuanced than that, something that doesn't require drama or ultimatums, something that simply asks you to look honestly at a question most loving parents have never been given permission to ask. Is going to visit my child actually good for me? Not, do I love them? Not, do I want a relationship? Not, would I do anything for them? Of course you would. That's not what's on the table today. The question is, when you leave, are you more yourself or less? Because here's what 30 years of clinical work has taught me, and what I want you to hear as both a professional and as someone who genuinely cares about your well-being. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between a person who hurts you intentionally and a person who hurts you carelessly. Your brain doesn't give you a discount on the damage because the source was family. Chronic low-grade emotional harm, the kind that arrives politely, dressed in obligation and routine, accumulates. It leaves marks. And the older we are, the less we can afford to keep absorbing it without consequence. Today, I'm going to walk you through 8 specific ways adult children sometimes treat their parents, not with cruelty, necessarily, but with a particular kind of carelessness that should make any loving, self-respecting person stop and ask, do I need to keep showing up here the way I've been showing up? 8 signs. Specific, clear, grounded in real clinical experience. Not to make you bitter, not to destroy your family, but to give you the language for something you've been feeling for a long time without quite being able to say. Let's begin. There is a particular kind of welcome that isn't really a welcome at all. You know the one. The door opens, the smile appears, and it's a real enough smile technically, but there's something behind it that feels less like joy and more like readiness. Like someone who has mentally prepared for an appointment, braced for it even. And they will be kind and patient and reasonably attentive, and at some point, usually around the 45-minute mark, sometimes the hour, you will notice something shift. A glance at the phone. A slight change in posture. A question that sounds casual but isn't. Did you want to stay for dinner? Or, the OR does all the work in that sentence. I had a patient named Patricia. 73 years old, retired school teacher, one of the warmest, most self-aware people I've worked with. She came to me after what she described as a gradual realization, not a single moment, but a slow accumulation of moments, that her son's home felt less like a place she was welcomed into and more like a place she was processed through. I started noticing, she told me, that he always seemed relieved when I left. Not relieved the way you are after a hard conversation. Just relieved. Like he'd completed something. She wasn't wrong. What Patricia was experiencing has a clinical name: obligation-based relational engagement. It is, in essence, a relationship maintained not by genuine desire for connection, but by a sense of duty, filial, cultural, moral. The person shows up for the role. They perform the expected behaviors. But the emotional substrate, the actual wanting to be with you, is absent. And here is what makes this particularly damaging, and why I want you to hear this as a neurologist and not just as a therapist. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to social authenticity. We have neural systems, mirror neurons, social cognition networks that are specifically designed to detect the difference between genuine engagement and performed engagement. You feel it before you can articulate it. That slightly hollow quality to the conversation. That sense of speaking into a space that isn't quite listening. That feeling, on the drive home, that you were there but never quite present in any way that mattered to the other person. And when that experience repeats, every few weeks, on schedule, it creates what I call chronic low-grade rejection, which is, in some ways, harder to recover from than outright rejection, because it's never quite bad enough to address. It's never quite clear enough to point to. It just slowly, quietly erodes your sense of being wanted in the world. Patricia eventually had a conversation with her son. Not accusatory, just honest. She told him she'd started to feel like a recurring obligation rather than a welcome presence. His response was defensive at first, then uncomfortable, then, eventually, honest. He admitted that visits had begun to feel like something to manage around his family's schedule rather than something to look forward to. That conversation was hard, but it was real, and it was the beginning of something different between them. Here is the boundary I want you to consider. Stop scheduling visits on their terms exclusively. If every visit is arranged around their convenience, their calendar, their capacity, if there is never any reciprocal reaching toward you, that is information. Respond to it. You don't have to announce anything. You simply become less automatically available. And you pay attention to what happens next. Because love, real love, notices when something it values goes quiet. This one can be harder to see clearly because it often doesn't announce itself. It simply surrounds you, quietly, without malice. And by the time you notice it, you're already deep inside it. You arrive. You find a seat, usually the same seat, the one nobody else particularly wants. Nobody introduces you to the couple you haven't met before. The conversation flows around you like a river around a stone, present, constant, and entirely indifferent to your existence. You ask a question, it gets answered briefly before the current moves on. You offer a comment, it lands in the air for a moment and then dissolves without acknowledgement. You get up to refill your own water glass because no one thought to ask if you needed anything. And the remarkable, terrible thing about it is that no one in that room would describe what's happening as unkindness. They would say it was a normal family evening. Edward was 76 when he first described this pattern to me. Retired civil engineer, a man of considerable intellectual depth and natural social ease, the kind of person who, in any other room, would be at the center of the conversation without even trying. He told me about an evening at his son's home, a dinner party with several of the son's colleagues and their partners. Edward sat at that dinner table for 3 hours. By his count, he was addressed directly exactly 4 times. Twice to be offered more food. Once when someone asked him to pass the salt. And once, near the end of the evening, when his son said, "Dad, you've been quiet tonight." I wanted to say, Edward told me, "I've been quiet because no one has been talking to me." Those are different things. He didn't say it. He smiled and said he was just a little tired. I want to tell you about something called social invisibility syndrome. It's not a formal diagnostic term, but it describes a real and measurable phenomenon. When a person is consistently present in social settings but consistently excluded from the actual social engagement happening in those settings, the neurological and psychological effects are significant. Cortisol levels rise, the stress hormone, in response to the cognitive dissonance of being physically present but socially absent. The hippocampus, which is our brain's primary memory and learning center and one of the first structures to show age-related decline, is particularly sensitive to chronic social stress of this nature. In plain language, being treated like a stranger in your own child's home is not just emotionally painful. It is, over time, genuinely bad for your brain. And here is what I want you to understand about why this happens. In many cases, it's not deliberate exclusion. It's something more mundane and in some ways more disheartening. It's habitual invisibility. Your children have simply stopped seeing you as a person who needs to be actively included. You've become part of the furniture of their life, present, familiar, and not requiring any particular attention, which might be the unkindest thing of all, because furniture doesn't have feelings, and you do. The boundary here is both simple and profound. You do not have to keep placing yourself in environments where you are reliably made to feel like background. It is not your job to show up and be invisible. If your visits consistently leave you feeling less seen than when you arrived, that is not a visit. That is an exercise in self-erasure. And you have spent far too many years learning who you are to practice forgetting. Let me ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it honestly, not to me, but to yourself. Think about the last 10 times your child called you or reached out to arrange a visit. Of those 10 times, how many began with some version of, "Mom, are you free this weekend? We were hoping you could watch the kids." Or, "Dad, we have something going on. Any chance you could come over and help with the grandchildren?" And how many began with simply, "I miss you. I'd love to see you. When can we get together?" If the ratio is heavily weighted toward the first category, if you find that your presence in your child's life is primarily requested when it serves a practical function, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, in clinical psychology, are the most honest thing we have. Gloria was 69 when she started tracking this, almost by accident. She'd been keeping a simple journal, nothing elaborate, just notes about her days, and one afternoon she was flipping back through it and noticed something that stopped her cold. In 22 months, her daughter had called or texted to make plans 31 times. Of those 31 times, 28 began with a request for childcare. The remaining 3 were a birthday, a holiday, and one occasion when the daughter needed help moving furniture. I sat there with that journal, Gloria told me, and I thought, when did I become the help? I want to be careful here, because I don't want to suggest that being present for your grandchildren is anything less than one of life's profound gifts. It is. The relationship between grandparent and grandchild is neurologically and emotionally unique. It has its own quality, its own particular kind of joy, and it is genuinely valuable for both generations. But there is an essential difference between being welcomed into your grandchildren's lives as a person they love and being deployed as a childcare resource by parents who have stopped thinking of you in any other terms. The first nourishes you. The second uses you. Being valued and being useful are not the same thing. And when you are consistently summoned for your utility, when the warmth of your reception tracks precisely with how much your children need from you on any given day, that is not a relationship. That is a service arrangement with emotional language layered on top of it. The limit here is not about refusing to love your grandchildren or withdrawing from their lives. It is about requiring that your presence be invited for its own sake, not only for its convenience. Try this. The next time you're asked to come over specifically to provide childcare, say yes to seeing the grandchildren, and ask genuinely when you might come for a visit that's simply about being together as a family. Pay attention to the response. A child who values you will make that happen. A child who has categorized you as a resource will find reasons why that's harder to arrange. The answer will tell you everything you need to know. Harold was 78 years old. He had spent 40 years as a structural engineer. He had read voraciously his entire life: history, philosophy, science, literature. He had opinions about things, strong and well-reasoned opinions, and he had always been the kind of man other people liked to talk with rather than merely talk at. By the time he came to see me, he had stopped sharing his opinions at family gatherings. Not because he'd lost them, but because he'd learned, through repeated experience, that nobody was particularly interested in hearing them anymore. What his family was interested in, what every visit seemed to circle back to, what every phone call eventually arrived at, was his health, his medications, his last doctor's appointment, his plans for the future when he couldn't manage on his own anymore, his contingency arrangements. I came home from my son's house one Sunday evening, Harold told me, and I realized I hadn't talked about a single thing I actually cared about. It was 2 hours of, "Are you sleeping well? Are you eating enough? What did the cardiologist say? Have you thought about the house?" And I sat in my car in my driveway, and I thought, to them, I am already just a series of problems waiting to get worse. This is one of the most insidious forms of inadvertent disrespect that adult children visit upon aging parents, and I want to explain why from a neurological standpoint, because it matters more than most people realize. When a person is consistently engaged with primarily as a collection of health concerns and logistical challenges, when the conversations directed at them are almost entirely about their deficits rather than their personhood, the brain begins to reorganize itself around that identity. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. Our sense of self is, in part, socially constructed and socially maintained. The way others engage with us shapes, over time, the way we engage with ourselves. When your children treat you as a problem to be managed, they are, slowly, invisibly, with the best of intentions, teaching you to see yourself that way too. And older adults who begin to define themselves primarily through their health challenges and their limitations show measurably faster cognitive decline than those who continue to be engaged as full, complex, intellectually active people. You are not a medical file. You are not a logistical challenge. You are not the sum of your most recent blood work. You are a person with a history and a perspective and interests and knowledge that took a lifetime to accumulate. And any visit to your child's home that consistently fails to acknowledge that consistently reduces you to your age and your health and your future care needs, is a visit that is, quite literally, not good for you. The limit here: you are allowed to redirect conversations that reduce you. Calmly, without drama. I know you're concerned about my health, and I appreciate it. But tonight I'd rather just talk. Tell me what you've been thinking about. Let me tell you what I've been reading. Give them the chance to meet you where you actually are. If they can't do it, if every visit returns inevitably to the management agenda, that is information you deserve to have. Ruth was 71 when she started doing something quietly remarkable. She began counting. Not in an angry way. She wasn't building a case against her children. She was just curious, in the way that someone who has spent a lifetime being observant stays observant. At family dinners, at holiday gatherings, during regular visits, she started keeping mental count of how many consecutive sentences she was able to speak before the conversation moved away from her, back to her children, to the grandchildren, to whatever was currently happening in their world. The average, she discovered, was just under 3 sentences. Before something redirected. Before someone else's story took over. Before the topic shifted to one of them, or to something that had nothing to do with what she'd been saying. "I'm not a bitter person," she told me very clearly in our first session. "I love my children. I love my grandchildren. I love being with them. But I've realized that being with them and being seen by them are two very different things. I can be in that room for 4 hours and come home without having been in a real conversation with anyone." What Ruth was experiencing is a relational dynamic I see frequently in families with aging parents, and it's worth naming precisely: one-directional engagement. It is a relationship in which one person consistently serves as the audience for another's life, listening, responding, showing interest, without that interest being genuinely reciprocated. The older person knows everything about their child's job, their relationships, their stresses, their plans. The child knows what exactly about their parent? What they've been thinking about lately? What book moved them recently? What memory surfaced last Tuesday and why it still matters? The painful irony is that the parent often enables this dynamic out of love, out of genuine interest in their children's lives, out of not wanting to seem self-focused, out of a lifetime habit of putting others first. And so they keep listening, keep asking, keep showing up as the most attentive audience their child has ever had. And their children, comfortable in the warmth of that attention, stop thinking to direct any of it back. From a psychological standpoint, consistently occupying the role of audience rather than participant in your own family's social life has cumulative effects on self-worth and sense of belonging. We are not designed to give without receiving. Reciprocity is not a luxury in human relationships. It is a basic requirement for relational health. When it is chronically absent, the person doing all the giving begins, slowly and often unconsciously, to feel that their inner life is not interesting to the people they love most. And that is a loneliness with a very particular, very quiet kind of ache. You are allowed to take up space in conversations with your children. You are allowed to have thoughts that deserve finishing. You are allowed to be as interested in as you are interested. If the natural flow of engagement in your child's home consistently carries you toward the edge of the room, if you are routinely the one listening rather than the one being listened to, that is not humility. That is erasure. And you don't have to keep volunteering for it. Let me ask you to think about something carefully. Before your last visit to your child's home, before you got in the car, before you knocked on the door, how did you feel? Not generally. Specifically. Were you looking forward to it with ease, with warmth, with simple, uncomplicated anticipation? Or was there something else? A low-level mental preparation? A quiet internal checklist? Don't mention that topic. Don't bring up that thing. Don't let them see if something bothers you. Stay light. Stay easy. Don't be a burden. If you recognize that experience, if visiting your child requires you to pre-manage yourself, to trim down your emotional presence before you even arrive, I want you to hear what I'm about to say very clearly. That is not a family visit. That is a performance. And the audience is not friendly. Marilyn was 67. Her daughter was 41. By Marilyn's own account, she had never been a demanding parent. Quite the opposite. She described herself, accurately I thought, as someone who gave more than she asked for and expected less than she deserved. But somewhere along the line, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when, a dynamic had developed in which any expression of need, any visible emotion, any moment of vulnerability on her part was met with a particular kind of response from her daughter. A sigh. An eye roll, barely perceptible but absolutely intentional. A comment about how, you always make things so complicated, or, here we go again, or the one that cut deepest, Mom, why do you always have to be so emotional about everything? Marilyn had learned to manage herself down before she walked in the door. I did it automatically, she told me. I didn't even realize how much of myself I left in the car until one day I drove home and felt this weird grief, like I'd visited my own daughter and she'd never actually met me. In clinical psychology, when a person consistently feels the need to suppress, minimize, or pre-edit their authentic emotional experience before entering a social environment, we describe that environment as emotionally unsafe. Not necessarily abusive, not necessarily malicious, but unsafe, meaning that authentic self-expression carries a predictable cost, and the person has learned, through experience, to pay that cost in advance rather than risk paying it in public. The technical term for the ongoing vigilance required to navigate such environments is hypervigilance, and it is physiologically expensive. It activates the body's stress response systems. It keeps the nervous system in a state of low-level alert. Over months and years, it contributes to everything from sleep disturbance to immune suppression to the kind of chronic fatigue that doesn't respond to rest because its source is not physical. You should not have to brace yourself to see your own child. That sentence is simple. I want you to sit with it. You should not have to decide what version of yourself is acceptable before you knock on their door. You should not have to manage your expressions, edit your feelings, or stay carefully inside emotional limits that someone else defined for you. If you do, if that preparation has become as automatic as putting on your seatbelt, then what you are visiting is not a sanctuary of family love. It is a place where you have learned, very efficiently, to make yourself smaller. And you have been making yourself smaller for long enough. I'm going to say something that I know may be uncomfortable, and I'm going to ask you to stay with the discomfort rather than immediately explaining it away. Think about the rhythm of contact between you and your adult child over the past year. Not just visits, all of it. Calls, texts, requests to come over, requests for help. Now ask yourself honestly, is there a pattern in what precedes the warmth? Is there a correlation, however uncomfortable to acknowledge, between your child's affection, their availability, their need to see you, and the proximity of something they need? Because Frank had noticed the pattern. He was 74, retired, comfortable, generous by nature. And he was, by his own careful account, not a suspicious person. He didn't want to see this pattern. He had actively resisted seeing it for years. But eventually, the data, as he put it with the dry precision of someone who had spent a career in finance, became impossible to ignore. I started noticing, he told me, that my son called about 3 times more often in the month before a large purchase or a financial difficulty than in regular months. At first I told myself it was coincidence. Then I told myself he just needed more support during stressful times, which I wanted to believe. Then one year I actually tracked it, and the correlation was nearly perfect. Frank's son was not a bad person. He was not deliberately calculating warmth against financial need, but he had developed over years an unconscious pattern. When life was easy and things were fine, Dad was in the background. When things got difficult or expensive, Dad moved to the foreground. Not because he had deliberately decided to use his father, but because he had never been required not to. Transactional love, love whose warmth tracks reliably with the presence of need, is one of the most painful relationship dynamics to recognize, and one of the most important. It is painful because it doesn't feel like manipulation in the moment. It feels like your child turning to you. It feels like being needed. And being needed by someone you love is, for many parents, indistinguishable from being loved. But they are not the same thing. Being needed means you have something someone wants. Being loved means you are wanted for who you are. When one consistently masquerades as the other, you are not in a relationship, you are in a transaction. And no matter how many years of genuine love preceded it, a relationship that has settled into transactional patterns is one that requires honest examination. I am not suggesting you stop helping your children. Help is love in action, and there is nothing wrong with giving generously to people you love. But generosity without discernment is not virtue. It's vulnerability. You are allowed to notice when the warmth increases at the beginning of a request. You are allowed to give from a place of genuine love rather than from a place of anxious obligation. You are allowed to say sometimes, "Let me think about that," and to notice how the quality of the relationship changes in the space of your hesitation. That change, if it comes, is information. And information, however uncomfortable, is always preferable to the alternative. This is, in my clinical experience, perhaps the most philosophically complex of the 8, and for many of my patients, the one that carries the deepest grief. Because this one isn't about what your children do to you in the present. It's about what they refuse to let go of from the past. Dorothy was 72 when she described it to me. She was a woman who had done genuine work on herself, the kind of sustained, honest self-examination that not everyone is willing to do. She had been in therapy. She had acknowledged the ways her parenting had fallen short in her children's early years. She had apologized, not in the deflective, self-protective way that apologies can sometimes function, but genuinely, specifically, with accountability. She had changed. The woman sitting across from me was, in meaningful ways, not the woman who had raised her children. And yet, when I'm with my daughter, Dorothy told me, I am never this woman. I am always the one from 1994. Whatever I say, whatever I do, it gets filtered through who I was 30 years ago. I can be warm, and she sees manipulation. I can set a boundary, and she sees control. I can ask a question, and she hears an accusation. It doesn't matter what I actually do. She's not responding to me. She's responding to someone who left the room decades ago. What Dorothy was experiencing has a name in relational psychology: identity freezing. It occurs when one person in a relationship refuses, consciously or unconsciously, to update their internal model of the other person. They have formed a fixed image, usually during a formative period of hurt or conflict, and they interact with that image, rather than with the actual evolving human being in front of them. For adult children who carry unresolved wounds from their upbringing, this is extremely common. And I want to be clear, those wounds may be real. The pain may be legitimate. The impact of difficult parenting does not simply disappear because time has passed. I am not asking you to dismiss or minimize what your children experienced. But, and this matters deeply, healing requires both parties to be present. It requires the child to be willing, eventually, to see the parent who is here now, not only the parent who was there then. And it requires the parent to be seen, genuinely, currently, as the person they have become, rather than the person they were. If every visit to your child is, at some level, a retrial of a case that was supposedly already heard, if your growth goes unacknowledged, your change goes unseen, your present self is consistently read through the lens of your past failures, then you are not in a relationship. You are in a verdict. And no one, having genuinely worked to become better, is required to keep sitting in a courtroom that refuses to update its records. You are not the same person you were 20 or 30 years ago. You have lived, and in living, you have changed. The people who love you, who truly see you, know this. They have watched it. They have felt it in how you show up. They update their understanding of you because they are paying attention to who you actually are. The limit I want you to consider: you do not owe anyone a lifetime sentence for sins you have genuinely acknowledged, genuinely worked through, and genuinely grown beyond. Accountability is not the same as permanent culpability. Owning your past does not mean being permanently defined by it. And if your children are only willing to have a relationship with the version of you that hurt them, if they have no interest in the version of you that survived that hurt and became something different, then what they are offering you is not a relationship at all. It is a role, and you are allowed to decline it. We've talked about 8 things today. 8 specific, recognizable patterns. Let me name them one more time, simply and clearly. When your children treat you as an obligation to be managed. When they make you feel like a stranger in their house. When they summon you as a babysitter on call, but rarely simply as a person they want to be with. When they reduce you to a problem to be handled rather than a human being to be known. When they keep you as their captive audience without ever turning that attention in your direction. When they treat your emotions as inconvenient drama that must be suppressed before you walk in the door. When the warmth of their engagement tracks with what they need from you financially or practically, when you have become, in effect, a transaction with a heartbeat. And when they refuse to release you from the past, insisting on relating to the ghost of who you were rather than the reality of who you are. 8 patterns. 8 different forms of the same underlying failure. The failure to see you as a whole, full, present, valuable human being who deserves to be in a room and feel glad they came. Now I want to say something very important, because I believe you deserve clarity rather than dramatics. None of these 8 things necessarily means you should end your relationship with your child. What they mean is this: you should stop automatically, habitually, unthinkingly placing yourself in environments that consistently make you smaller. That is a different thing. That is not abandonment. That is not cruelty. That is not even, ultimately, about them. It is about you. About the portion of your life that remains. About the question, the simple, profound, under-asked question of what you would like to do with it. Because here is what I have learned in 30 years of sitting with people in the later chapters of their lives: the ones who thrive, genuinely thrive, not just survive, are not the ones who held on to every relationship regardless of what it cost them. They are the ones who, at some point, made a quiet and courageous decision to stop organizing their lives around people who made them feel bad for being alive. They didn't become bitter. Bitterness is what happens when you stay in the pain and stop moving. They became selective. They became present. They turned their attention and their energy and their remaining time toward people and places and experiences that reflected their actual worth back at them, And in doing so, they discovered, often to their own surprise, that there was far more of that available than they had ever imagined. So let me leave you with the question I come back to with every patient I've ever worked with who found themselves in this place. Are you visiting out of love? Or are you visiting out of hope that this time will be different? Because those are two very different drives. Love is sustainable. It gives freely and it can absorb disappointment without being destroyed by it. But hope that this visit will finally feel like a welcome, that this time your feelings will matter, that this occasion they'll ask about your life, that this Sunday they'll see you, that kind of hope, repeated without evidence, without reciprocity, without any real sign that anything has changed, is not love. It is a slow erosion. And you have too much left to give, to the right people, in the right rooms, who will receive it as the gift it actually is, to keep pouring it into spaces that have stopped being able to hold it. Your presence is a gift. Stop giving it to people who treat it like an inconvenience. Not in anger, not in bitterness, not in punishment, but in the quiet, clear-eyed recognition that your time, the time you have left, the mornings and evenings and ordinary Tuesdays that make up a life, is not renewable. And it deserves better than routine disappointment dressed up as family obligation. If something in today's conversation resonated with you, if one of these 8 things landed somewhere specific and real, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. You don't have to share details. Sometimes just a number is enough. Number 3, all of them. Number 6, for years. You might be surprised how not alone you are. If this video was useful to you, please give it a like. It helps others who need this conversation find it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Strong Elderly Life. We are here every week with honest, grounded, real conversations about what it looks like to live with dignity, clarity, and genuine self-respect in this season of life. You have earned that. Every last bit of it. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.